I'd like to invite the COVID panel to come forward and unmute yourself and turn on your cameras. So we have Julie Hossapple from AZ, Steve Kern, and Ben Rhodes, David Leventhal, and Becca Sudlow. So there's really been a, just to talk a bit more, there's really been a clear interest in these data for COVID based on what we're seeing in search, but we're really grateful to these members represented here, represented by entities that have been sharing or going to be sharing COVID-19 data. Industry members in the last few years have received approval for or EUA for some of these therapies. Gates supports grantees to share data through coronavirus trials through Vivli, and in a typical process, data is shared anywhere from 12 to 18 months post-regulatory approval. Clearly, there are some unique challenges we find ourselves in that could not have been foreseen even 2 years ago. We look forward to having a discussion or reflection on best practices as we're now 2 years into this pandemic. So we believe we've really assembled a unique panel and look forward to hearing from each of them on this subject. So we'll have each panelist take 3 or 4 minutes each to give the reflection on the current state of COVID data sharing, best practices, and some key learning. So we'll start off with Julie, and we'll go around. So Julie?
Hi, Rebecca, thanks. Hi, everyone. Julie Holtzapfel from AstraZeneca. So, boy, the current state of play with COVID data sharing. I know there's a lot of interest and a lot of effort that's gone into data sharing. I think the biggest data sharing that we've seen so far has largely been through work done under EMA Policy 70 and Health Canada's PRCI process. There's been an exorbitant amount of documents that has data from various data cuts that's been pushed into the public domain through those avenues. To me, what's interesting is I haven't seen much uptake on their use, and I would definitely love to be proven wrong and to see publications and some real use come from that. I know that we've put a lot of effort into thousands and thousands of pages being prepared for disclosure at different points during the process for the COVID products. I think that was one of the first places that we've seen data come through. I know that now we're seeing a lot of technical results. We're starting to see our lay summaries come through, and we're starting to get to the point in the policy perspective where these studies will qualify for requests for data sharing. And I think that's a good thing from the Vivli platform perspective. So, many of us have policies that talk about a certain period of time after studies are completed and when the products are on the market that they become eligible for research requesters. And so I think you're seeing some of that come through as well, which I think is a good thing. What's exciting to me is to think about where the research can pull some of this data together and what we can learn in the coming years reflecting back. I think a lot of the initial reaction was a bit of a scurry to try to get data out there in a lot of different ways. And I hope that as we move forward and we look at where we are today and what we can learn over the next 5 to 10 years from this data as it becomes available, we can actually start to figure out where the value comes from. What is providing the most value for data sharing, for furthering health, for learning about treatment. I think that is where we all have great opportunity as we think about data sharing through this pandemic, where it's been, where it is today, and where it's going. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that unwind over the next few years. So that's my initial thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. Steve Kern.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Rebecca, for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to speak from my experience with the Gates Foundation, which was what I was heavily working on COVID projects during the 2020 to 2022. So one of the things that we did at the Gates Foundation was to take opportunity of the COVID crisis to change the way we had been approaching data sharing. So we've been long promoting or asking or requesting our grantees that they share the data from investments that we've made, and we've signed on to some of the international agreements from that dating back to 2017. But one of the things that we found is as we implemented it, we tend to have that conversation at the end of a grant, the end of a project, when investigators are least interested in having to think about pulling together data and sharing it and putting it somewhere. And, fair, they're ready to move on to new things, they're wrapping stuff up. And then all of a sudden we remind them of this massive task that they perceive as massive that they need to undertake. So we use COVID as an opportunity to then put the discussion at the start of the project. And by having that up in the front end, and in the conversation as we were getting projects off the ground, and then giving our grantees enabling tools and funding to actually be able to meet that requirement, it just changed the conversation dramatically. And, playing off of one thing that Julie said, we've long been requiring in grant agreements, but in all honesty, those are words, not in the agreements, they're words, and the investigators don't always know what that actually is going to mean for them when they get to actually having to do it. So we put it up on the front end. We made tools available for people, resources, individuals, R scripts, things of that sort that they could take advantage of. And importantly, we put a funding milestone on the front end. So we would start the project with a little bit of funding to get it going, but they didn't get the catalytic funding to actually execute the study until that plan was in place. And now that we have it in place, okay, we're all agreeing on what we're going to do. Let's go. And when we did that, then, it made it a lot more tenable for investigators to get involved. So the ability and the willingness to comply, just gets greater as a consequence of that. So that was on the funded side. And, on the partnered or non-funded side, we did a lot of work in partnership with pharmaceutical companies in terms of trying to synthesize information to provide insight to the general public. And I will have to say that we had a tremendous response from pharma partners, particularly driven by individual champions within companies who really wanted to help make this data, particularly for drug trials and repurposed molecules, not in new entities per se, to make it available so people could see and understand, well, what were the results saying? And so I think that individual champion was really key. That individual champion's success was determined more by the processes that already existed in their company to allow them to kind of move that data through the whole pipeline and get it out the door quicker. And we were really at this point just talking about high-level summary data, not individual level data that people could use, say, in a meta-analysis type of approach. So, I think having that willing partner was really key. And I'd say a lot of times there were more willing partners that were coming out of industry than were coming out of the non-industry academic world, at least in terms of this willingness to share. But it really struck to me this effort that we have to continue to push on, where we have to make this process ordinary instead of extraordinary. Right now, it's still extraordinary. And if we make it ordinary, just like you are doing now to put in the data at the end of studies within a year, that are listed in clin trials, we make the processes regular that people can know how to participate. And we just lower all those technical barriers to having people share data. Then the only ones we're left with now are willingness or unwillingness. And those are issues then we can start to address, I think, with people or individuals or organizations about why they have that unwillingness. But right now, I think people get bogged down by the technical or they hide behind it. And then, that becomes a barrier. So the more we keep pushing this in the right direction, and I know we're going to hear later from Susan Gregorick at NIH about their requirements, I think you're going to see that evolution going. And then funders who are investing in the tools to make it simple, straightforward, and even someday beneficial to those investigators, will take this a long way to improve the situation. So that's my opening remarks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve, for those thoughtful reflections. Ben Rhodes, Lily.
Hi, thanks, Rebecca, and it was great to hear from Julie and Steve. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we did, which was a little different than our normal policy. Now, first, Lily's trials were looking at treatments for COVID as compared to prevention of COVID. So we had a conversation internally in the company to say we want to make the data available as quickly as possible, and modified our policy for this particular situation because some of the trials were looking at compounds that were already on the market, and this would be an additional use, and some of the trials were looking at new treatments. And we knew that those new treatments could potentially get out, quicker than the normal process through emergency use authorizations or other activities around the world. So the modification was to move it to just 30 days after primary publication. We would make a list of trials available, regardless of what the approval status was of the compound. Now, sometimes the primary publication was of an ongoing trial, and so we would have to do data cuts and make just the data cuts available and anonymize the data when they were requested. We were prepared for that. We did get a lot of requests, but then there were a lot of requests that were canceled or removed. So there really weren't a lot of pull. There wasn't a lot of pull for the data yet, even though we were listing the trials and making them available. It was an interesting observation. I don't know if that was just because everybody was so worried about actually trying to treat the patients instead of doing the research, which is awesome. I'm glad that we were able to make treatment a priority. But we were able to make the data available. We also made some other changes, such as this clinical study report may not be available because that's going to take longer than 30 days after the primary publication. These publications were coming out as quick as possible as well. And then we had the other situation where not all of our trials were ones that we were running. So one of our compounds was included in an IAID trial. And that we were not the owners, the sponsors of that trial. However, those data are now available. I've gone to the NIH site and seen the trial listed. So it's good to know that those data are available as well. And I don't know if Vivli will have any conversations later on about those data being available in Vivli as well. Or can obviously be brought in by the researchers to do additional research. So that's really our big thing from a COVID perspective. Trials are still ongoing. We still have a few things that are being closed up. We're still listing new trials as they become available. But this was an internal discussion that did have agreement all the way up to the top that said we would make the data available and list the trials as quickly as possible.
Great. David Leventhal from Pfizer.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rebecca. I think the prior presenters, laid out, I think, what are common challenges for all of us. From a Pfizer perspective, I mean, we had everything that's just been said plus. So we had both vaccines and therapeutics. So and our vaccine was a co-development vaccine. So we had the challenge of working, working with a co-development partner. We're fortunate in that we are the primary, in possession of that data. So data sharing becomes less of an issue when your development partner is in possession of that data. But I think our partnership with BioNTech has been very positive, and we've been all in agreement around the importance of data sharing. I'll echo what Julie has said. There have been FOIA requests as well as Policy 43 requests that have been affecting our document disclosure part of the organization. Those have been quite challenging, just keeping up with those kinds of requests, and as well as the requests coming in from multiple sources in multiple ways. I think what we ought to be doing is making sure that Vivli is known and understood as our primary mechanism around data sharing, because I think many investigators are simply asking individual companies, hey, we want you to share data, or despite the fact that we have all of this up on our websites and what our policy and practice is, there's still a tremendous demand and not always an understanding of how we work. I think a particular challenge for Pfizer is with all of the boosters and things still under emergency use authorization, we're trying to be responsive, to all the data requests that are coming in, and the landscape is changing so rapidly, and we keep, continuing to do additional studies. We want to meet our commitments of, 18 months post-primary completion date, and even go a little sooner, but then you run into the challenge of, possibly getting out ahead of your publication policy, and we simply can't do that. So there's things that we need to manage. So it's deeply complex in our situation, but I think everyone's done really an admirable job of keeping it all together. And we're for our primary large study, vaccine study, we're preparing. Actually, the data set is already prepared and anonymized, and we're working with Vivli to make that, to get that up. Those are my comments.
Thanks so much, David, and that's really wonderful news. Rebecca Sudlow?
Sure. I don't know if it's an advantage or disadvantage going last, but yeah, I kind of agree with everything everyone said before, and maybe the Roche experience is much more similar to Lily's, and that Ben described, is that we were very much playing in the space of, we had an established product that could be repurposed for the treatment of symptoms of patients hospitalized with COVID. So when we had conversations about how we wanted to build on the already sort of great foundation we had in working with the Vivli platform and the way, Vivli works in normal situations, how do we want to do things differently? And so maybe it was a slightly different conversation because the context wasn't, new vaccines, new things that the regulators hadn't seen before. So I know we worked with Rebecca and others at Vivli. We actually decided to pre-list studies before they were ready for sharing, to give researchers an opportunity, if they wanted to submit a research proposal early and do all the sort of the paperwork that was needed so they could get the data fast. We did that, but I don't think that was ever actually called on. I don't think we got any sort of advance requests like that. And then on the Roche side, we also decided to move away from our current process, which follows the FPA Pharma principles of putting to share once EU and US approval, and actually decided to pivot it around when the clinical study report was written off, or it was signed off. So that was much faster than usual. We attempted to do that. That was our best efforts, but you've also got to manage the fact that the teams were very busy working. So we did post those data much earlier than planned, but perhaps not quite the same day the CSR was signed off. That was perhaps a bit impractical. And our experiences so far have been, we didn't get a huge rush from the minute they were available to be requested, but since then we've had a slow and steady. I think we've received 6 research proposals so far, and we've currently got 5 studies listed. So it was an interesting experiment, and I think it's something, like you say, to reflect on what we need to be doing when we're in this situation next time. So yeah, and like I say, it's built on the foundations of the well-oiled machine that is the Vivli platform. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this panel discussion to see how we kind of move forward in the future.
Yes, thank you so much. And so for those of you that are participants, please post questions in the Q&A, and we can certainly get to them in that section. So questions that you might have for each other, and I could certainly get the ball rolling as well, is, how do we prepare for the future? I think it's really admirable how all of you have stepped up during this time of pandemic. We're about 2.5 years out of this, maybe 2 years from the start of the pandemic. So reflecting back on everything that you've done, and clearly all your companies were really not focused necessarily, some of you are very focused on data share, but the primary thing was to make therapies and get them out the door, right? And data sharing, all of you have made changes in how you've done data sharing during this time. So I think it's really admirable how you've all stepped up. And I've seen also how this has changed somewhat your typical process, your way of working. So those are all admirable things. How do we move forward from here? So I'd just love to hear from you. Moving forward from here in terms of COVID data sharing and other things when we see the next, major pandemic, as we probably will. How does that prepare us for the next big thing?
Well, I think I'll go ahead and start, Rebecca. I think the first thing is we hope and pray that it doesn't happen again. And I know that may be naive, but also I can look and say from a historical perspective, the last pandemic wasn't in my lifetime. So I'm going to hope that another one doesn't occur in my lifetime. If for some reason that does happen, I think the research environment has shown that all parties can get behind trying to take care of these type of conditions and trying to find the information and develop products as quickly as possible, both to treat and prevent. And that's fantastic. And I'm, as a parent of a child who is premature, I'm excited to see things like RSV virus that's now, going to potentially have a vaccine in the future. So, those type of things that have come out of this potentially are great as well. From a moving forward perspective, I don't know that we will change our policy. I think we're going to keep our policy as it is for all future products, probably because, as Rebecca said, we didn't see a big pull for these data being made available so much earlier. We're going to continue to make data available, and I think as we continue to see industry, I think leads that, and we want to continue to push and show that the publications that result from this can actually make a difference in patients' lives, and let that be our message. Let it be that making data available for additional research actually leads to positive outcomes for patients. When we see that, we'll continue to see more and more pull for the data and more uses. That's kind of how I want to go moving forward. And if we do see additional publications coming out of this that lead to better treatment and better research plans for the future, then that's where I would want us to push forward.
Yeah, and I would follow on with what Ben said. For us, I think it's about proactivity, and we're deeply involved in work now to make sure that part of study hygiene, that the pre-packaging and anonymization of all of our data and listing that data with Vivli is just kind of part of what it is that we do. At least at Pfizer, and I know others I think are doing a better job at this, getting out in front of the demand. So not waiting for researchers to ask for the data, to simply have that as part of our study closeout activities, package the data, make sure Vivli has it. And then, so that's one thing. And the other, and I think it's really important given everything, we've learned so much during the pandemic and, the loss of trust in institutions and vaccine hesitancy. There's, moving to Pfizer's move to a full independent review of all research requests. And we started utilizing, Vivli's IRP this year, after not for a long period of time, and being now in alignment with the pharma, fully in alignment with the pharma and FPA principles. We think that reputationally, that's how we ought to be working. It's, and I think what is necessary it's one small thing to dispel a lot of the fears and distrust, that has, you know, kind of blossomed throughout the pandemic.
Thanks, David. Ben, anyone else?
Yeah, I
So-
would just, go ahead, Julie.
I think one of the things when we think about furthering data sharing that we've been challenged with for years is standards and interoperability. And the smaller the population, the harder that is. What I think we have an
Right.
interesting opportunity here, particularly, you know, probably selfishly thinking about the vaccine space, is there's so much data out there. I think it would be interesting when the timing allows with the different data sets to look for opportunities to support researchers with common anonymization approaches to create interoperability, to allow true pooling of data, to learn from what happened during the pandemic. I think this is something that's generally really hard to do, having been in the details of preparing anonymized data sets and documents over the years. And as much as we've all talked about it, and we've all said, yes, there are standards out there. It's more like standard options, not standard ways of having data sets with the same age bands and the exact same ways that you could mash all the data together and actually analyze it. So I think that's probably an interesting, unique opportunity coming out of the pandemic that potentially could provide some opportunities for greater interoperability going forward. And obviously that takes, you know, the right mindset of coming together in support of the right research to agree on ways of providing that data. But to me, it's an interesting opportunity, I think, that could come from this wealth of data that will be coming available over the next, you know, couple years at the right timing for the different studies. Once all the follow-up data is completed, you know, there's lots of safety following that's going on for the different vaccines, et cetera. But to me, that's something that when I just think about the large number of patients that are out there and some of the conversations we've had with the agencies when it came to documents and the anonymization and the goals and the strategies, I would love to see that happen at some point. I think it would be quite interesting from a research perspective and for us as data contributors to figure out. It just came to me when Ben was talking about sort of the future and hoping not to see this again, but thinking what could we learn and how could we further this. So sorry for cutting you off there,
Thanks.
Steve.
No, and I appreciate both yours and Ben's optimism. I tend to be a pretty optimistic person, but I can tell you in 10 years in the Gates Foundation, I worked on 3 things that we called pandemics. So I don't think this is going away. And monkeypox is a good example. And now we've got RSV. So, but the point is, I think which I appreciate is, you know, David described how Pfizer's going from extraordinary to ordinary. And to Julie's point, you know, trying to get even summary level values where everybody agreed what that summary value was, not easy to do. It's really hard to do in the, you know, on your nights and weekends when you're doing it in excess to your day job. So part of what, you know, being involved in these situations has taught me is that we can't design ideas sort of in the calm period and then put them on a shelf and then pull them out and hope that they're going to work. They won't, I can guarantee you. So part of it is understanding, you know, continuing to exercise them in practice and think about how do we turn some of these principles into just what we do ordinarily. And if we can do that, then we'll be able to get to that point. But I love the point that Julie made early on in her opening remarks about the value. And I see there's 2 questions in the chat from Andrew Friedman and Georgie Humphreys about, you know, how are we going to get the value of increase the secondary requests. And I think one of the things we have to do either as a funder community and maybe also as the data generator community is work together to incentivize some research to understand that value. Because what if in the end we go, you know, what we learn is not really that helpful, then we shouldn't keep running around doing this. We should try to think about, well, what is really valuable and then how do we learn from it to help inform what we do next? And, you know, we could do that as funders. It'd be really interesting, again, if some of the big funders would make this fundable research, because it's not generally viewed as novel, right? And so therefore it oftentimes falls to the wayside in terms of that. So I think that's going to be an effort you'll see in Gates Foundation. And then, you know, Julie, I take good comfort in actually watching what the Odyssey Network has done, you know, on sort of EMR type of data and clinical care data. They've been able to self-organize into a common framework And if you look at the work that Danny Prieto Alhambra's team did at Oxford, boy, they were able to synthesize data from all over the globe really quickly. And I'd be curious to think about whether we could get to something Odyssey-like, right, in the future for the clinical studies as well.
I do think the point on value really has to be picked up, right? You know, I look over transparency in all aspects of it at AZ, and it's a constant, how do we put it? Reach for resourcing, right? We support transparency because we believe in it. And if we know where the value comes from, we are here to better the way patients are treated and to help the world learn this. If we can figure out where the value comes from and put the resources there, you can get 2 or 3 times as more out of, say, controlled data sharing versus open data dumping. And I mean, that is my hypothesis, that we see a lot more value from the controlled, targeted scientific data sharing. But if on the flip side, we are continuing to try to make data just randomly available to anybody on the internet, from a privacy perspective, that's super hard, time consuming and cumbersome. And then from a utility use lessons learned perspective, we have not seen the uptake in that yet. And so I think if we really want as a group of stakeholders to make the most out of transparency and the wealth of information from clinical trials, it is truly about rallying around where the value comes from. And I can't stress that enough, that I would love to see a wind of change come through and really look at that from a value perspective versus a just check box exercise, which I think is happening as the call for transparency becomes more and more. I think we have to focus on the use cases. We have to focus on who really needs the access to make things valuable. It's not that everybody and their brother needs to know what happened to everybody. It's that qualified researchers need to be able to use this data effectively in an interoperable, scalable kind of way. So that's one of my big hopes that I'd love to see a shift in over the next few years.
And
absolutely. And go ahead, Rebecca.
Sorry, I was going to say, I don't know if this is sort of heresy talking on a call like this, but I do feel a lot of the interest was around documents and summaries, and we all get excited about data sets because of our background. And maybe there's a realization that there is a bit of a pyramid of interest, and maybe there is also a bit of a time lag. Maybe people want to get hold of the documents quicker to really understand the insights. And maybe that's why, I mean, Ben, we've seen more, it's been a slower pull of data rather than perhaps what we're expecting. So maybe also kind of realize there's different levels of interest and types of information people are after. But I also totally agree, Julie, interoperability is always going to be an issue. We have issues even with our own company, our own studies. We were, it's like even your own company trying to sometimes combine data, let alone trying to do it across organizations. So I think that's definitely something we should be looking at.
I'd love to know more about what you... Just responding to Rebecca, seeing a pull for the document, I'd love to know more about what documents and how they've been used, because I know I've been talking to folks at other companies. We're all watching to see how these documents are used. We haven't seen anything come to light. So there is the idea of just, I feel like I have the right to know everybody's business. And then there's the idea of, I want to actually do valid research to drive the world to a better place, right? So not from like a just broadcasted on CNN kind of perspective, but usage perspective. I'm truly interested if you come across some examples on that. I would love to see it, and I know through FPIA we're trying to actually do an assessment of where this value is coming from. So it'd be great input if you have any lessons to share or data points you can share from how documents that have been sought have been used. That would be really interesting to me. Sorry, Rebecca.
No, that's okay. So it sounds like, just to summarize, the Policy 70 uptake has been pretty robust. But I also want to follow up with what you're saying, Julie, is the interoperability could be the barrier, because I see a question in here is, what is the value and what are the barriers? And it's perhaps the barrier is the interoperability. I mean, all of you are using CDISC format, at least for the pharma trials. And I think, you know, lowering the barrier to access is something that Vivli is really thinking about in our next push, and how we can, I think that could be a big project for us, is how we can think about lowering that barrier to access. I mean, we do have investigators coming to us. Many of them are thought leaders in the field, but they don't have really the skills to do IPD meta-analysis. I think that's really important for them to do that. We do have a question in the Q&A that asks about, do any other organizations ask for access to data from others? Does anyone want to answer that? I think the answer is no. We haven't seen that yet.
Well,
I mean, we do actually.
I was going to say, I think we've seen
Go ahead.
a few cases of it, and it's dependent upon what the research is, and and whether it's something that's going to be perceived as a competitive interest, or if it's advancing the science, and then internally discussions that occur around that, and the age of the product, and any number of other things that go into those discussions. I think to Julie's question about the documents, I would say the only anecdote that I know is prior to Policy 70, obviously there was always a European request for information that occurred. And interestingly enough, it was pharmaceutical companies requesting other pharmaceutical companies' documents, and it didn't lead to publications. It was for internal use of freedom of information type of documents. So I would assume that that's still ongoing with Policy 70 or with Health Canada, that individual companies are going out and looking at the information, not downloading it, because the terms of use state that you can't download it unless you're going to be using it for research purposes, but anybody can view it. So that's probably what is occurring. But no, I've not seen anything from a publication of additional science.
Well, just following on, Ben, we are all routinely involved in consortium level data sharing, whether it's through Transcelerate or through the Innovative Health Initiative in Europe. And, we have shared goals in those data sharing arrangements. So we're routinely doing those kinds of things. And, I think interoperability is a challenge, or the consortium many times asks for data that is outside or is slightly different than what we've prepared the data for Vivli. I think what we would like to see happen, certainly, back to Julie's call for standards, when we do anonymization of a data set, that we would like to utilize that for our multiple engagements, rather than having to go back and recreate every time we need to do that. So, I mean, again, our study hygiene, we are going to be prepackaging our data. We would like it, we would like to share as widely as we reasonably can with as many as we can. But it needs to be in the format that we've elected to share it in. Otherwise, it becomes unscalable, and then you have the problem of not being able to fulfill those data requests, which is a problem. I think the one other thing, just tangential to what's already been said, I think data types is another challenge, particularly for many diseases, imaging and genomics, and the things that we're currently not routinely sharing through the Vivli platform are more and more being asked for. And as a operational process, we have to treat them kind of as one-offs and enter into, you know, data sharing agreements, you know, based on these data types. It would be of course wonderful if you know, if we had the ability under a common rubric to share these other, you know, images, for example, with the underlying clinical data. And then the other kinds of things that have been coming in, I think, is for, you know, observational studies and for data of which we have no control. So we often get data requests for data, you know, for observational data that is being collected by others. You know, and Pfizer is involved in that research, as we all are, but we're not the ones who are actually the data owners and don't have the ability to share that data. So I think we'd love for there to be some sort of process to be able to get to that type of observational data as well, because I think the demand for that is very high.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's something that we could certainly work on with you. Thanks, David, for your thoughts. I mean, just to get to, in the last few minutes, maybe, given how slow research culture is to change, is there thought on maybe the value not showing up for some time? So there being a time lag. It might take just a while for researchers to come around to using these resources. I mean, COVID, you know, given, you know, a lot of these requests are for oncology and diabetes, which of course has been around for, you know, forever, but COVID has just been here for 2 years. So that is one question that we have is that something that it might take some time for them to come around to using these resources?
I think that's where we have to put the incentives to really accelerate that understanding, back to the earlier point about what's the value, you know, in doing this. So I think we need to step that up as generators of the data, funders of the data, and do that collectively. But I'd also argue that you need to then change the mindset of the publishers of the results, because, you know, I think we've had funded a pretty good effort of some really top tier statistical people to do summary meta-analysis of trials that Naveen Zarifa led, with many people from many of these companies and very high qualified statisticians. And despite that, it's not getting taken up by the publishing. You know, the publishers have COVID fatigue right now, basically. And so the idea of, you know, oh, a summary, we're not even interested in that, right? So all of that really gets in the way of trying to really advance this as a science. But I think it's a key component, because my hunch is similar to what, you know, Rebecca and Julie are saying. It's an 80-20 situation. But I bet 80% of the things we really care about, we can answer with pretty high level summary data. And only 20% really need to dig down to the individual subject level. And if we tiered it that way and found a way to do that, I think you'd get huge value that would come out of this. But that's a hypothesis to be proven.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for your thoughtful reflections. This has been, I've learned so much during this panel and really advanced the conversation forward.